I'm just as curious as you are to see how this works out. I think we might begin with a quotation from, for the sermon today, from Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. The past gives us our vocabulary and fixes the limits of our imagination. We cannot get away from it. There is, too, a peculiar logical pleasure in making manifest the continuity between what we are doing and what has been done before. And this is what I wish to italicize. But the present has the right to govern itself as far as it can. And it is always to be remembered that historic continuity with the past is not a duty, it is only a necessity. These words are a good point of departure for our topic tonight, which can and has excited no end of irrationalities among the rational. And surely no subject for discussion exists to which is devoted a greater welter of essays, tracts, articles, books, and all manner of communications through which swirl the passionate gusts of controversy. One might as well ask what there is to say now, tonight, that is new about humanism and its relation to science and scientists. Well, the answer is that as long as there are humans, there will be something new to say about the meaning of humanism and man's quest for knowledge in the context of humanism. My own interests as a professor in the natural sciences do not qualify me to present this lecture other than the very special framework of my own interests. In fact, like most other professors, at least here in America, adequate reflection has not been possible for me. That remarkable humanist, Oliver Heaviside, put it well in the celebrated passage from his treatise on electromagnetic theory, in which he said, I will quote, "For my part, I always admired the old-fashioned term natural philosopher." This, I might say, was written in 1891. It was so dignified and raised up visions of the portraits of Count Rumford, Young, Herschel, Sir Humphrey Davy, etc., usually highly respectable-looking elderly gentlemen with large bald heads and much wrapped around the throats, sitting in their studies, pondering calmly over the secrets of nature revealed to them by their experiments. There are no natural philosophers nowadays. How is it possible to be a natural philosopher when a Salvation Army band is performing outside? Joyously it may be, but not most melodiously. But I would not disparage their work. It may be far more important than his. The famous Hoosier philosopher George Ade has once said in a fable and slang, now in America, a fellow who goes up hanging by his feet from a balloon is called a professor. So, within these limits, I may discuss the humanist concern tonight. Things have changed for the worst since Heaviside's time, but scientists, I think, are going to have to find time somehow to concern themselves with humanism and its aims. Scientific creativity has supplied the basis for an explosive development of technology, which in turn has created wholly unexampled social and political pressures on a worldwide scale and confronted humanity with the extreme choices of living as ethical beings or perishing as unreasoning brutes. My distinguished colleagues in this lecture have been dealing with two important aspects of humanitas, its meaning and problems of communication in its context. I suspect, however, they would agree with me that the meaning of the word and the spiritual attitudes it represents are not easy to define in a way to which all intellectuals would subscribe. I believe Sir Julian Huxley has called it religion without revelation. This is an apt phrase, but one which certainly can cause no end of trouble because it requires a definition of religion and an understanding of revelation. I would just as soon try to discuss the concept of genius, which is just as mysterious. I am reminded of a story in the New Yorker magazine when an interviewer went to see a member of Duke Ellington's band and got the brilliant idea of asking him, "Do you think your boss is a genius?" And the gentleman in question was shocked at this question. He never thought of it before. And after some agonized appraisal said, "Gosh, I don't know, but he sure can eat." The only thing that is certain about humanism is that everyone is in favor of it, because no member of humanity would want to admit that the principles on which he lives are not humanist principles. Every intellectual, religious, and political discipline attempts to present its doctrines as acceptable on the basis that they are humanistic. Professor I. Silver has made a partial list of the varieties of humanism which may be discerned as past or present entities, beginning with classical and going through medieval, Renaissance, literary, civic, Christian, Catholic, Reformed, and other theological, theocentric, and devout humanisms, to the anthropocentric and intellectual variant known as scientific humanism. We even have totalitarian humanism. Everybody seems to be getting in the act. Everybody seems to have a vested interest in humanism. Recently, Huxley has formulated another anthropocentric version, which I think might very well be the one in which I am most in sympathy, and which I would like to quote from his recent article in Nature. Julian Huxley, this is. No relation to the Huxley of 1850 and 60. The knowledge explosion of the past 100 years has given us a new vision of human destiny, of the world, of man, and of man's place and role in the world. It is evolutionary and monistic, showing us all reality as a self-transforming continuous process, with no dualistic cleavage between soul and body, matter and mind, life and not life, natural and supernatural. May I say in passing here in footnotes that the next sentence bothers me. All phenomena, from worms to women, from radiation to religion, are natural. I object to the use of words to women. I don't like to see sex chauvinism at any time. Now to come on to this paragraph. It leads inevitably to a new dominant organization of thought and belief, and after centuries of ideological fragmentation, to a new and comprehensive idea system which I call evolutionary humanism. Now, of course, all these words mean very little to us, but let me go on. Its upshot is clear. Man is not merely the latest dominant type produced by evolution, but its sole active agent on Earth. And that is the important concept here. Man is not merely the latest dominant type produced by evolution, but its sole active agent on Earth. He is responsible for the future of the evolutionary process on this planet. Whatever he does, he will affect it. He must try to understand it and its mechanisms and to steer it in the right direction. In carrying out this operation, he must not sit back and expect supernatural aid. Its overriding aim must be defined in positive terms like fulfillment and achievement, greater fulfillment and less frustration and misery for more human individuals, interlocking with fuller achievement and less muddle and failure by more human societies. This must be secured by a fuller realization of human possibilities. To realize this aim, man must learn to live in harmonious symbiosis with his planetary environment, a responsible partner instead of an irresponsible exploiter. He must abandon the heuristic idea of conquering nature. He must cooperate and conserve. Now, this, I think, is a fair statement of the kind of humanism with which we are now concerned. The idea that man is a cooperative agent and not an exploiter. I would like to come back to this later in connection with the topic of education. I must apologize for reading from notes. This is a very thorny subject, and it is possible to make stupid statements off the cuff. So I am going to confine myself to the labors that I perpetrated this morning and in the few hours I had to reflect on this subject. Now, to come back to the original question, does science exist outside the humanistic concern? Well, as we have seen, humanism is a man-centered belief in the notion that man has in him the innate capacity to do what he will, accidents, of course, accepted, acts of God accepted. Well, the next question is, what is science? And here I think we should talk a little bit about science. I had hoped perhaps at this evening to have this had an informal basis and to have run a poll here of what you in the audience think science is and what you think humanism is, because that might give me more of an idea of what I should be talking about. But I understand this is not possible, so I will go on with a small survey of science and then come back to the question of its role in humanism. Science has changed since the old days. Science is essentially a matter of change. As contrasted with the classics with the absolutes which are presented to us in the classics, in Latin, in Greek civilization, in Chinese civilization, where there are such absolutes, absolute concepts as good and evil. We have in science only a method for the observation, accumulation of facts by experimentation and observation. And these two things, science and humanism, therefore are qualitatively different things. Now, science would have to, therefore, be considered in the context of humanism only insofar as it is informed by humanism. Let's take a look at what has happened to science since the time of the Greeks. The ancient Greeks equated science and philosophy in the cliche, which is used most of the time. Greek science was armchair philosophy, or armchair science. It was possible to sit and think about phenomena and deduce their nature. Experimentation was considered a demeaning thing, and in fact this was a reflection of the whole Greek society based on slavery and the notion that there were free men and slaves. Now, however, science did have in it at that time, and philosophy did, the notion that man could think his way out of dilemmas without the aid of the gods, and in fact by doing so he became a god. And this, of course, was a cause for some suspicion. In fact, Socrates, as you know, was accused, I read the quote here, he searched into things above and below the earth and did not believe in the gods. Well, the science which they had was different from the science we have today. While they reached their conclusions by induction, the facts that we have now are gathered by induction and observation. I have a story to tell about this business of the difference between the inductive and deductive. Told to me by James Franck years ago in connection with a convention of electrical engineers that met in Königsberg. And you know, the electrical engineers are pragmatists. They are interested in the practical things, and they will derive their notions of society from an inductive approach, whereas mathematicians could, in general, be classed as deductive, although mathematics is also an experimental science in many aspects. Well, the German electrical engineers wanted to have some tone to their convention, and so they thought it would be nice to have some great thinker come and extend the benediction. In passing, I might say this would be inconceivable in this country. Anyway, who was the great man in Königsberg? It was David Hilbert, who was the founder of topology, essentially, and one of the great mathematicians of the time. And so the heads of the engineering group went to David Hilbert and said, Professor, it would honor us if you would talk to us. He said, but why me? And they said, well, we would like you to come and tell us that there is no real conflict between pragmatists and deductive scientists, data theorists. We want you to dispel this notion there's friction between them. They are all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to learn one way or another, and they're all facing the same objective. And Hilbert said, that is a very wonderful idea, and I'll be very happy to help in any way that I can. So he came to the meeting, and he got up and said, ladies and gentlemen, you may be wondering why I'm here, why I, an experimental theoretical mathematician, would be addressing a Congress of Electrical Engineers. He says, some people seem to think there is friction, there is disagreement between the approach of the mathematician and that of the engineer. He says, nothing could be farther from the truth. They have nothing whatever to do with each other. In many respects, there are such areas in science today, the relict of the Greek approach, and there are also the same kind of difficulties in the conversation between classicists and scientists. Now, the Romans were a little bit different from the Greeks. Outside of Archimedes, there was still, however, very little in the way of experimentation. But Lucretius did see science and religion in opposition. He saw man as becoming equal to the gods through abandoning the superstition in favor of reason. And of course, one of the tenets of humanism is the abandonment of superstition in favor of reason as a man-made trait. Now, in the Middle Ages, there was a considerable amount of development, and in the Renaissance, humanism was born, with its looking back toward the classics as a source of inspiration for man's quest for perfectibility. And science was indicated as a means of helping in this quest. Now, modern science could be best expressed in terms of one of the great exponents of it, Lavoisier, who said, never form any conclusion which is not an immediate consequence necessarily flowing from observation and experiment. And that is modern science. And insofar as this can be done, it applies to the kind of knowledge with which we deal in science. Now, there are many kinds of knowledge to which this cannot be applied. At least we don't know how to do it. And these are areas in the social sciences, in many cases, and also in the humanities. What we see here is a dualism in which the scientist and the humanist must come together somehow and inform each other. There is no such thing as two cultures, for instance. There is only one culture. But there are all kinds of arguments about who has a prior claim to them. Now, these controversies about the nature of science, its essential inadequacy, are not new. They have gone back in the centuries. There was an argument between Matthew Arnold and Julian Huxley at the very beginning of this business in the middle of the 19th century. Dostoevsky has his statements to make, and the brothers Karamazov about the essential inadequacy of science. And Sigmund Freud has his comments to make about the inadequacy of humanism. And everybody makes stupid statements. Now, it seems to me that it is important to realize that you cannot carry over a mere observational technique into areas in which we are dealing with intuition, at least yet. And on the other hand, I cannot say that it is impossible. In the future, this can be done. The only thing you can do is keep on working. You may not be able to see what the future holds, but surely nobody could have imagined what the future would have held 20 years ago as what is happening now. Even the most rabid science fiction writer could not have thought of the sort of things we see happening daily and what's happening today out there in outer space, for instance. Well, there is a crisis, all right, the crisis which has been memorialized by the term the two cultures. It's a crisis in communication, and this tells us nothing, of course. I think one of the easiest phrases to use in escaping from responsibilities is to blame everything on communication. I think that we will have to look into this matter tonight at some length, if you don't mind, and maybe we can find out something about it. First of all, it must be remarked there is a crisis in communication in the sciences themselves. And this comes from the fragmentation which results in overspecialization, which is a characteristic of modern knowledge. The accretion of knowledge is enormous. Nobody can comprehend it anymore. And one of the major problems in our civilization is information retrieval, as well as talent retrieval. I think that this in itself is a big problem, let alone the problem of the lack of communication between the classicists and the scientists and the general public. And yet there must be some communication established, because what the scientists do has a direct relation to what's going to happen to civilization. And it is important for everybody to understand what the aims of science are and what the scientists are trying to do and what they are not trying to do. Now, the discussion centered around the term of two cultures exemplifies the confusions which exist and which come from an oversimplification in terms of caricatures or stereotypes of scientists. In the novels of C.P. Snow and in the attacks on him, we are dealing essentially with an argument based on maintaining the notion that there is a thing called the scientist, and over here a thing called the humanist, and that there is a thing called literary civilization and a thing called scientific civilization, and that these have somehow or other advantages with respect to each other. It will be of some interest to the historian 30 years from now to conjecture as to why there was so much argument and so much controversy about these questions of the two cultures. It doesn't seem, when you look at this analytically, that there should be any argument at all, but it appears that there's an emotional content of this question which exists in the nature of a breakdown of communication, which causes the most extraordinary statements of vindictiveness and malice and the general also Christian charity. Now, Snow's notion is that literary culture and scientific culture exist, that the members of the cultures are mutually incomprehensible and intolerant of one another, and that this is dangerous. He ascribes certain virtues of scientists which make them better able to deal with the harrowing times we live in than their literary fellows. In holding his views, he has ruffled the sensibilities of his literary colleagues. Most scientists who have a clear head about this, Mr. Burnell is one, have concluded that what is at issue here is not the particular expression of two cultures, but the reality that is behind this expression. We cannot afford to be split any further. We should really get together and understand that we're all trying to do something about the development of knowledge and how it must be integrated into modern civilization. Lionel Trilling, in an article in Commentary, has probably produced the most adequate comments on this whole question, this whole labored question of the two cultures. He states, he questions some of Snow's unfortunate allusions to the pessimism of literary people. One of the outstanding traits of modern literature is its general depression and the more grim, bleak, sordid characters which are presented to us as characteristic of modern times, and where there's no hope and no future, in contrast with the literature of the 19th century, in which there was a very strong reform, in the writings of Dickens and Mills, and that Snow has overemphasized this as an example of the essential nature of literary culture. Literary culture, in other words, is pessimistic. You might as well lie down and die, because nobody's any good. Well, on the other hand, Snow points out to the incurable optimism of the scientist, who ignores all of these things and goes ahead working and producing more problems. Well, we have to break the existing pattern of education, but we don't know how to do it. It is not enough, of course, to point to the science and scientists on the one hand and literary person on the other as though they were important. The fact of the matter is we have politicians too. And it is the politicians who run the world. And the question is, how do we get through to them? And Trilling points out that what we really have to face here is the inadequacy of the notion that reason will take over the whole management of the world, and soon, and that there's no point in discussing the relative merits of scientific philosopher kings as compared with literary philosopher kings when politics goes on doing just as it did at the old stand all along. So what we really have to do is, there's nothing is gained really by describing the resistance to reason as other than it is by thinking in such species terms as two cultures. What we have is culture and non-culture. And the question is, how does culture penetrate non-culture? And I think in that context, therefore, we can dismiss the notion of two cultures, except as a problem in education. The actual process of discovery and of creation in the sciences differs in no way from that in the arts. The scientist coming into his laboratory is faced with a lot of inanimate and stubborn material, out of which he has to somehow or other make an experiment that's meaningful. The artist coming into his studio is faced with an easel and some colors and some paints, and he has to express himself somehow. And the process which goes on before something happens is identical in both cases. You can take this on with a novelist too. Well, now when you have an activity which is based on essentially the same procedure, whatever it may be, namely creation, it is hard to see why there should be any questions about the relative merits of these, or which is most likely to succeed in some way in being more important to mankind. The fact of the matter is that creation, whatever it may be, must be encouraged, and it must be sought wherever it can be found. And I think that there is a certain amount of snobbishness in each of these intellectual disciplines about the way in which each does its own work. There seems some notion that a novelist, by the virtue of the fact he works with words, is in some way superior to a scientist who works with things. Well, the only thing that really comes out in the end from all this is that what is the effect on humanity in general, and where does the scientist fit in the humanist concept? And the answer, of course, is that he doesn't fit there as a scientist making observations. What he fits in is a human whose observations are going to have to be used by humanity in one way or another to achieve what the aims that Huxley talks about in evolutionary humanism. And this becomes to be, in other words, a problem in education. What kind of education are we going to devise which will take into account the lessons that are inherent in the classics, and at the same time which will give the child a sufficient background in facts which are stubborn, with which he has to deal. It will do no good to consult the Bible or the classics for remarks which tend to substantiate the notion that a nuclear war would be desirable. These things have nothing to do with the facts. There are facts, there are stubborn facts, and they have to be faced on their own merits right now. We can't look back. On the other hand, if there are things to be looked back at, they are the aims of making people better than they are by showing examples of what happens when they aren't, as we see in the classics and in most of the literature which is given to us, and we are told we must learn in order to find out what we are. Well, I suspect that if you take the evolutionary viewpoint and think about mankind as evolving constantly, changing constantly, it will be very interesting to see what kind of human we see 100 years from now. I think we have different people now than we had 100 years previously. Certainly, in the physical sense, they're bigger, they're better nourished, and so some of the problems that came from these matters have long since disappeared. It was quite a different society when smallpox and bubonic plague were essentially 100% predictable as going to happen to you sometime in your life, and when you didn't know whether demise was around the corner in some mysterious way which you could ascribe to the gods, to supernatural agencies. Nowadays, we don't consider public health a matter for supernatural agencies. So the society has changed somewhat. It is likely that most human beings have a fair chance, when they are born, of being allowed to develop into social beings. Now, this is not true in many parts of the world now, but one of the things that science should be doing is making it true. And what I want to talk about in the last 15 minutes is what the scientists are supposed to be doing outside of their science. I think that I'm not going to give any moral lessons. I just want to talk about the scientists in the context of humanism in this connection. That there is a problem in connection with its communication is obvious because, before I go on with this moral homily, that there is a problem is obvious from the fact that the American Academy of Sciences announces that at its 183rd annual meeting will be devoted entirely to the question of a redefinition of culture. And it states here, the relations between the humanities, the social sciences, and natural sciences, and in particular between the research functions of each of them, have recently been the subject of much interest, but not of enough serious investigation. For example, the ways in which progress in one area may depend upon discovery in another are scarcely understood. The extent to which new disciplines depend upon a transfer of methods and of personnel from many older disciplines is only now beginning to be inquired into. And the question arises, how may we redefine culture in such a way that the sciences are seen to be valid components of our culture? That's the question, isn't it? How do you define culture so science is included? Well, there is a big literature of science which could be included in culture, and I think that this has been neglected by the humanists to a large extent. they seem to think that the only place, that is, these are the classical humanists, the only place where one can get a lesson in moral virtue is out of the works of the old Latins and Greeks. And maybe they don't mention the Chinese, but I suppose they would if they knew about them. So it seems to me that you have to look at some of the works which have been prepared, especially in the 19th century by the English. Now, there was a speech here that I think one of my illustrious predecessors spoke about the problem of mass communication and how it distorts the real meaning of words when you have to communicate concepts to a mass. This wasn't a problem in the 19th century to many great scientists. Faraday, for instance, was able to communicate his ideas quite well. He did complain that in his contacts with other scientists, that they were over-mathematical in their presentations. I can recall here a quote from one of his letters in which he said, writing to Clerk Maxwell, "There's one thing I would be glad to ask you. When a mathematician engaged in investigating physical actions and results has arrived at his own conclusions, may they not be expressed in common language as fully, clearly, and definitely as a mathematical formula? If so, would it not be a great boon to such as we to express them so, translating them out of their hieroglyphics so that we may also work upon them by experiment?" This is the cry of the experimenter to a theorist. I think it must be so, because I've always found that you could convey to me a perfectly clear idea of your conclusions, which, though they may give me no full understanding of the steps of your process, gave me the results, neither above nor below the truth, and so clear in character I can think and work from them. If this be possible, would it not be a good thing if mathematicians writing on these subjects were to give us their results in this popular, useful working state, as well as that which is their own and proper to them? And Maxwell felt the difficulty, and he said, "For the sake of persons of these different types, scientific truth should be presented in different forms, and should be regarded as equally scientific, whether it appears in a robust form in the vivid coloring of a physical illustration, or in the tenuity and paleness of a symbolical expression." Now, this notion has been lost sight of in the years since Maxwell. Scientists have tended to the notion that what they are doing can't be expressed in common language. Now, it is perfectly clear that there are many things in modern physics that cannot be readily expressed in common language, but there is nothing that is being done by men which cannot be translated sufficiently comprehensively to the ordinary intelligent layman. And there's no question about this, because you can see it done every day in England by people like Ritchie Calder and by others who take the time to delve into this. And there is a large and growing and devoted group of science writers in this country who are doing a very good job with regard to explaining what is happening in science. And this is one of the first things we have to explain, we have to do, is to make sure that what is going on in science is understood in general, in its broad aspects, by the public at large, and that it is not presented as some kind of magic, because humanism has nothing to do with magic. This is one of the contexts in which scientists work inside humanism. Now, with regard to the moral implications of science, every human has a right to consider himself part of the community. And a scientist should be just as interested in what's going on as anybody else, even if he is considered less likely to have a coherent opinion. Now, because he's so specialized. Well, I might point out to you that in the rhubarb, which took place right after the Manhattan Project ended and the atomic bomb was suddenly presented to the president and the politicians as a problem, it was the scientists and nobody else who took it upon themselves to inform the country of the dangers implicit in nuclear warfare and what the facts were. They were not very good at this. They didn't have Russell Birdwell. They didn't have great propagandists helping them, and they had a very limited budget. But they went to work and did something which in effect brought into existence the McMahon Act and caused 10 years of persecution for many scientists who were the recipient of the reprisals from the group that wanted, whether advised or not, to have military control of atomic energy. It was quite a good deal later, after the problem had been thoroughly hashed out, that the literary world began aware of the fact that there was a problem. And in fact, it's still, as far as I can see in the novels that deal with the problems that are raised by nuclear science, there is still a rather juvenile approach to it. So I think that the scientists cannot be faulted, at least for this performance, and they are, in general, maintaining in a very limited way an attempt to keep the public informed on issues of primary importance for existence and survival. But nevertheless, there is no end of adjuration from theologians and our colleagues in the humanities for the scientists to realize their moral duty. And everybody keeps saying it's up to the scientists to save humanity, which it has put in peril. Well, I think the best thing that can be said about this is that everybody's got to find out what science is all about and realize that scientists are working as humanists, most of them, whether they know it or not, and that they are all eager to get some expression of understanding from everybody. Now, there is I think finally I might make the quote to you a statement that was made by Father Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame, on the occasion of a speech at California Institute of Technology last November. And what he said was, "How free are the ignorant of this world, how free are the diseased, the undernourished, the homeless, the poor, and those without hope for themselves and their children. There are many things that science and engineering cannot do, but there's one task that is made to order for them in our day, and it is to buttress freedom, to better the conditions of mankind on earth, to liberate man from his ancient servitudes, to provide for man a human situation in which he can truly manifest his dignity, practice his freedom, and follow his higher spiritual calling. That is why I said earlier that in our day, science can be the great liberator of mankind." I think with that I will close this lecture.